We are standing in an empty warehouse in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. It is the first day on the set of the movie based on Girl Boy Girl, How I Became JT LeRoy. I don't know exactly who's clamoring towards the monitors. I just know that we are all there. Later, I will come to realize that many who kneel down towards the light of the screens to take a snapshot with their smartphones are, in form, called continuity people. Nonlinear. And so am I think obliquely. A continuity person keeps the reality of the artificial world of the film intact, maintains the integrity of the fiction by making sure that glasses don't fill themselves, ashes don't reconstitute themselves into cigarettes, and time works in only one way, forward. In writing this memoir, shortly after the experience of embodying JT LeRoy had ended, I had a similar expectation that the conventions of the form would impose a linear shape to the mass of memory and emotion coalescing and diffusing within me. I wanted to trace how I had come from point A, agreeing to do a one-time appearance as a fictional alter ego of my brother's partner at the time, writer Laura Albert, to point Q, 6 years of becoming so deeply entangled with this fictional character and the writer that I could barely think of myself without him or his creator. Writing down the story from memory became a process not of convincing, thankfully, but of specificity and viewpoint. This viewpoint is told from the perspective and experience of the object. Yes, I just called myself an object. And that's the thing about getting inside of your own meta world. You become your own disassociated ant moving through space in service to the story, and any detail of your life is always readily available to pluck and plunk into the master script. Sometimes you have to address whether the story is running roughshod over what you want as an actual object in the world. I became used to referring to myself, even existing in the third person, which it turns out is exactly as liberatory and circumscribed as the first person. I just ran up against parameters in different places. My story is the story of multiple bodies trying to occupy one body, specifically Laura and her fictional alter ego, JT LeRoy, and me, all trying to occupy my body. Things get tricky when there is no space. And that is maybe the challenge that kept me going back for more JT experiences. I wanted to see how much could be housed in this body. At moments like a chorus, these multiple voices come together to share one consciousness in sync. At other moments, the story holds just one person trying to fit into another's very specific set of terms. Another person trying to cram everything they need into the world into another's set of terms. The story, told from memory, ends up being the messiness and complication of two people's intimacy, the constant testing of each other's boundaries. Savannah and Laura's desires fuel the action in the story. Why they want what they want, potentially a series of pathologized reasons tethered to the past, becomes irrelevant. It is what they want in the present and in the future that keeps them with each other and with JT and propels them through time. At the moment of the reveal, this tenuous balancing act collapses, and when the world crowds in, that is when I discover the limits of what my body can hold. In writing the screenplay of Girl Boy Girl, co-written with the film's director Justin Kelly, once again I found myself retelling the story and felt the changing shape of it under my fingers. Story glitches, an outsized emotion, an unforgettable image, a motivation that once felt so personal and now can barely be remembered, are smoothed and traced over again, transposing memories until the logistics fade and the emotions materialize as one clear trajectory. Stepping away from the cluster at the monitor, I zoom in on the actors' faces on my handheld device, dumbstruck by the familiar, yet alien gestures caught on screen. The spaz-out, campy stress mouth of Laura's fictional author, JT. The knee bend, the hands up dramatically toward the sky of Laura's fictional best friend manager of JT, Speedy. A day and a half before the movie begins shooting, I am driving with my sweetheart Lee through the blinding light and low scrub brush of the Badlands when I receive a text from Justin. He wonders if I could make up a few sentences of JT prose for the reading scheduled to shoot the following Monday. As Lee drives, I pull out my old beat-up laptop from the back seat and stretch my legs up on the dashboard, staring at my socks, feeling absolutely hopeless. A few pithy sentences. That's all. Think about style. Think about emotion. I try to move my mind towards the proposed word puzzle, something that points to the prose, but is not the prose itself. I look out at the side mirror, the plumes of dust rising in the wake of our car. I haven't read the JT books in a while, but they are, to some degree, seared into my brain. There is a part, I mumble, where JT and his mom are on a road trip, and she anoints him as her map reader. And he can't really read the map, but he pretends he can so that he can hold his mother's attention. I look ahead. Fill me up, spirit. Fill me with some idea, with words. Lee starts to say something about, there is a blade of light, an ashtray flying through the air. I grab it, I type rapidly, and the cigarette butts, they scatter on the ground. Words dart like small fish from our mouths, and we catch them and transfer them into different vessels, like we are cleaning the water in a fish bowl. The sun has risen to its highest point, and the land shivers around us as if we're surrounded by a lake. JT, he arranges them in a row, tap, 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 color-coding them with circles, with rings, with lipstick rings. We pour the bright fish back into their bowl, each shade a different secret need. As we hit a main artery road, we speed down the freshly paved highway, whizzing past the freshly rolled haystacks. We are elated, ready to start another piece of text. Lee blurts out, "My buddy Lucky's got the goods." And then, abruptly, we are pulled over by a cop for speeding. Fuck. The car is a mess, full of crap from both of our lives, commuting back and forth between coasts. I look down to notice my seat smeared with chocolate, my feet wading in corn husks, raw corn, a favorite of this trip, orange peels, trash, and cracker crumbs. By happenstance, we are white, and not by happenstance, the cop lets us move on without too much ado. That night, we get into Bow Bells, North Dakota, and find the number of a woman advertising that she has a few cabins on a lot for rent. There is a constant, steady, cool wind blowing like a kiss. In bed with the window open, we hold each other, and I lie awake. Now in the night, as the wind floats through the curtain towards our heads, it feels more pressing, the wind, insistent. I can feel my anxiety matching it. The winds of memory glitching into the future and into the past. When I wrote the memoir, one of the last things that Laura said to me was, just because you played a writer doesn't mean you are one. And looking back on it, I do wonder about that. It feels mysterious to me. Writing fiction is a space of possibility for inhabiting different consciousnesses, for impersonation. Is writing only in the saying, or can it also be in the doing, out in the world? Speeding down that highway with Lee, writing under deadline, about to arrive at the movie set, which felt like some approaching mirage. There was something about that moment that felt not exactly like playing a writer, but like living inside some reality that was not exactly my own, because the proposal of the day had been to write someone else's words, I was free to imagine and to speak with a different voice. I had tapped into the joy of pretending, joy which enters suddenly and then leaves as fast as it came. Granted, the pact on the page between author and reader is quite different from the terms with which individuals out in the world interact. Out in JT land, the boundaries are blurry, hard to read, and ever-shifting. There might, indeed, be a reason why people don't often play with this sort of writing performance verite out in the world. And that is that the complete blurring of the lines between fiction and lived experience can fundamentally fuck with you and everyone around you. There are other versions of the story from other points of view. I'm vaguely certain that art cannot be everything for everyone. And in telling the story as specifically as I can, I hope it inspires others towards their own individual perspectives. Girl, Boy, Girl is a portrait of a young person's life in which an artist, Laura, upends my core belief system and changes the way I think about the world and the making of art and life forever. My life with Laura, with JT, and many experiences since have shown me that one set of terms does not work for everyone else. Lived experience, felt experience, and imagined experience all combine to construct our idea of reality. And the hard drawing of the line between truth and fiction is artificial and will always work to empower some voices and muzzle others, regardless of where the division is made. I used to feel certain that reality was a complete construction. And these days, whether because I've grown older or because current events in our political climate have gotten so fantastical with real consequences, I'm not certain. To quote the Savannah character in the movie, all I'm sure about is that I'm not so sure. But every time I revisit this story, it reminds me that truth is a constructed reality formed by multiple sources, that the most pointed moments of reveal are usually a convergence of years of multiple actions, often a tangle of call and response from multiple parties that rarely fits tidily into a headline or a soundbite. So that's the new intro for the book. Thank you.
Just listening to you read, what struck me is that you're quite unapologetic about this. There's nothing in there that sounds like you're in any way trying to come down one way or the other, right? It almost sounds quite philosophical. Has that been the product of years of thinking about this? Did you always feel that way?
Yeah, I think it is a product of years of thinking about it. I think writing the book, I wrote it it was shortly after the sort of unveiling in the public unveiling in the Times. And so I think when I wrote it, I think the book is actually very raw and really trying to figure out what had happened and what my responsibility to my own actions was, and also a kind of confusion about my relationship with Laura and my relationships within the story and where the intimacy lay. And so I think after years now of doing rewrites on the film, it has shifted sort of.
Right. And with the film, I mean, there's a lot of intimacy between, as you say, the Savannah character and the Laura character. There's a
third person.
Yeah, third person always, right? These are characters,
yeah.
Right? There's a lot of intimacy. There's also a lot of intimacy with the Asia Argento character. There's a lot of intimacy there. But what's interesting is that you don't always know what this intimacy is, right?
Right.
So there are sections where, she's saying to you, and when we talk on the phone, and this is happening, and you're kind of, the Savannah character is like, yeah, absolutely, totally. There's all kinds of like relational depth that the character doesn't actually know about. Was that what it was like when you were playing JT?
And it's relational sort of projections, I think. With Laura and I think in sharing the character, it would sort of be like you try to keep up with what had transpired between you and another person, and you'd relay it, so it was always a translation. And I think the phone is a sort of character in the film, as this sort of like, it's the filtering system. There's always this sort of screen in front of the different people's interactions with one another, and why, what is kind of just like about relating to each other purely, and what is, there's intention, or things that have to get done, there's needs that have to be met.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So did it feel, I mean, you talk about sharing your body with all of these other bodies.
It's a bit dramatic, but it's kind of true.
Could you elaborate on that?
I think it was, I mean, I do think that because it was for 6 years, and it did start sort of casually, and then by the end, it did feel like, I remember that we'd gone on a book tour, and I looked down at my body, and it was a kind of dysmorphia, but it was just like, this body's housing all of these different needs. And JT did sort of feel like a person who had needs as well, a separate entity in some ways as it went on. So.
What kind of needs?
Well, for one, a material housing, like a place to go.
Right, a place to be.
To be an embodiment. Yeah, and then I think Laura and JT's needs were fused in that they wanted to be out in the world and wanted to have, you know, like she'd made all this work, and so had that character for her. So, but and then in turn, I think I had needs that I had placed, or that I had found through playing the character, that I felt like I could access through that playing JT.
What were those?
Well, I think it had to do with sort of being a queer person in the world and also making art, and realizing that that was possible, that that it was kind of like, this is how it could feel.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so when that initial unveiling, how did that feel for you?
That was, it was gnarly.
Because it was very, the journalist who kind of uncovered it was almost quite sort of, not flippant, but very sort of like, here are the facts, this is just a hoax, this is, it was almost like, I want to say dismissive, if you know what I mean, but like kind of unimpressed, you know what I mean? He just seemed very kind of like this, just laying it kind of all out. So what did it feel like to be on the kind of receiving end of that?
I mean, I think in some ways it was lucky that there was always a disguise, because at least I had my privacy as a person. People didn't recognize me or anything, so that was, I think, a blessing. But it was sort of like, I'm sure we've all had these experiences where you have a chapter and you kind of wrap that thing that you're doing around you and who you are and what it means, how you navigate the world, and then if there's some break in that, like even we were talking about, if you've been a classical performer all your life, and like I have friends who are dancers, and when they decide they don't want to be a dancer anymore, it's like, who are you in the world and how do you navigate it? And it's something about that kind of break. You have to really kind of build yourself back up. And it takes time. And I went to the bathhouse a lot at that time, and there was someone who worked at the bathhouse, and they would say, I don't know, you always looked so raggedy. Like, I think it's just kind of, I don't know, it was a very internal processing.
Right. When you were going to the bathhouse?
I think just after that time, it was like a few years of, okay, where's me? And I think writing the book was a part of this process.
Right. Absolutely. Because in the film, and I kind of want to talk a little bit more about the film now, actually, like sort of...
I'll warm up.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get you going. But in the film, there is that really great scene where you know, literally you get the hat, you get the wig, you get the sunglasses, and it's almost quite sort of this construction of this character almost feels functional, you know?
What do you mean?
Functional in that I was like, okay, so if I was going to try and construct somebody that I was going to take out into the world, I would be trying a lot harder, you know? I would to make it, like, believable.
Right.
You know? And
yes.
there always seemed to be, even when, like, you look back at the photographs and everything, there's always this little chink.
I mean, yes.
So what was that?
I think that's about, I mean, there's a line in the movie that it's sort of, the character is trying to explain it to someone they know intimately, and it's like, they're like, how can people believe this? And I feel like now looking back on it, people always say that, like, how did anybody believe this? But I think it was a sort of, it's about that contract of like, why wouldn't you believe it? Why would we not believe each other when we say things? Which now we're in a whole other phase with that. But also, it's a kind of emperor's new clothes. Like, he says he's wearing clothes, so he's wearing, you know. And I think Laura, like, as far as, because I think Laura really did sort of, it was sort of like the way she would operate, he'd be like, I'm just gonna try this out. And to me, it was like, it dismantled all of my preconceptions about how you did things and how you were supposed to be and how things got, just the process of navigating the world. And she had a very like sort of punk, I'm gonna see what happens with this. And she would drop her accent once she'd established it, or things where it'd just be like, let me just see if somebody notices. And that was this mode. I think that's part of, like, it'd always be a chink because in a way it was, I don't know, I mean, I don't know why, but that's part of it.
I guess that relates to what you sort of said in the introduction about people generally don't do this in real life because it messes with your relationships.
It messes with you.
And it messes with you.
Yeah.
Right? And I guess it messed with you too.
It messed with me too, yeah. Yeah.
Like, do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Like,
no, I think it's all there, sort of.
Yeah, I think it's all there.
Yeah, it's all there. It's all in the...
Read the book.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And even in the intro.
And in the intro. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose when you were writing the film and you were kind of like going over it again, were there specific things you were kind of trying to achieve or trying to set straight?
Not exactly. I think with the film, like, I do think this is it's a kind of very long-ended project to some degree. Not that it started out as a project, but in some ways writing the book was about translating an experience. You know, memory is a form of fiction in some ways. You remember it through your own filter. So it was translating what had happened into this form of a memoir. And then again with the movie, I really did feel the translation of the memories, which actually I probably wouldn't remember 80% of it at this point. I feel like when I read the book, I'm like, wow, that happened. And there's a lot more details in the book than in the film, partly because, of course, a film is a much more compressed form. And so it wasn't, I mean, I think it would be, in film, it's sort of like you have to establish your characters and their drive. And it wasn't about sort of like a kind of propagandic, like I've got to make sure people, it wasn't about a sort of like defense as much as it was just making sure that the characters that in some ways were just the characters of the film that had at some point flown from the book, they had taken on their own lives, sort of, but that it made sense that their motivations and their sort of emotional trajectories that their bases were covered, and that it. I think one question that kept coming up was when we were writing the script over and over, because we would have people read it and give notes and stuff, and it would be like, why would this character keep going back and keep doing this thing for so long? And through the mode of the film, it was sort of like, because in writing, you can get into all the internals and what you're sort of feeling at the time, but how did you express that over and over through events and through a visual form?
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, when we talk about meta,
right.
We're kind of talking like meta, right?
Right.
Because you performed a character that you then wrote into a film, and then you watched this person perform this performance that,
right.
that you'd written.
Right.
Not many people have this life experience. Like, you know, this is very unique. So what was that like? What was it like watching Kristen Stewart play someone you played?
It's very weird. It is, I think it is, it's sort of about, like, when I say I don't totally remember, I mean, I do, but also I think from writing the film, like a lot of my memories have merged and been transposed by doing these drafts of the film, and so memory's a very elastic thing, I think. And I do have to say that after watching the film, and I watched different edits of the film and would give notes and stuff, it was a very open dialogue in that way, but that I don't flinch at all when I watch it, except for maybe some of the sex scenes, which is just kind of, it's just embarrassing maybe, but especially if your mom is watching it or something and you're like, yeah. But I do just feel like it makes sense to me, and it feel, objectively speaking, it makes it, so it's something about like the personal and the subjective and the objective feel like it feels whole when I watch the film, and that's, I don't know, it feels like a miracle to me.
And do you think that Kristen Stewart does a good job? I
do. I think she does a really good job, and I was saying to you, my mom saw it and was like, Kristen is the James Dean of our time. She really gets it. She really gets it.
It's almost like, you know, this character could, I mean, there's been so many, you know, there's been several documentaries, there've been so many articles written.
Yes.
And you know, a lot of people have said, you know, this is actually a character that you can go out and you can find people who are actually like JT LeRoy. Absolutely. It's almost like this position, this role could be replicated. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like now Kristen's done it, and maybe someone else could do it.
Right.
You know, you can have like lots of them walking around. You know, have you ever thought about?
Or it's almost a stand-in too, in a way, for people's lived experience. You know, there's that too.
Yeah. Like, what do you mean?
I mean, that people have lived, we have terrible experiences in our lives, and I think, you know, that material, or, you know, that you have real hardship in your life, and I think the JT character is sort of it's not a stand-in, but it's someone who was broken. That was part of the character. And as far as a kind of franchise of that character, I don't know. I mean, it's just, there's something that, I think this story holds so many, you can really tease out different themes in it, and people do, and they find, there's enough in this story that the people can really tease out different parts of it. Some people want to focus on the family aspect, or you want to focus on the kind of external, the scandal, the celebrity, or, you know, that people keep finding. There's just a lot in it about identity, and to me it's really about interpersonal. That's, I think,
like family
where
dynamics.
It lies. Yeah.
Did this bring you closer to your family?
No, but it allowed me, I mean, no and yes, and neither here nor there maybe, but it did allow me to feel to really kind of be with the emotions and the interpersonal of the story. Or just also realize, like, I'm an intimacy hound and such, you know, that is maybe where, after years of working on this, but also making work, that I feel like that's my obsession, sort of.
Intimacy and community and the interpersonal.
And how can we be with one another? How do we actually, and where does the intimacy lie?
Because you said something about, like, you no longer like to tell even tiny lies, you know?
Yeah, I said that, like, in the notes.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that you've just, that's no longer the way you want to operate.
Right.
Right.
Because maybe it is sort of like, you try things out, and yeah, I was saying that after a while, what was the theme that came from? I can't remember, but
I think it came under the sort of hoax.
The hoax bracket.
Yeah. that whole thing.
The post-truth bracket.
Right.
But yeah, that I feel like through doing JT, there's a part of me that I think it's just a curiosity of, like, what happens if you, like, I remember when I was a kid, a parent's friend saying they had an affair. And that was, to me, very mysterious in my mind. It was sort of like, what does that mean to compartmentalize and have an affair? And I remember thinking about that later, and like, but that's like a version of maybe like, what happens if you just, instead of saying, I don't want to go, I'm just so tired. This is like, I'm making it very minor, but if I don't want to go and I just say, like, you make up an excuse rather than telling the truth of, like, I don't want to do it, or, you know, that there's ways that you don't want to disappoint people, but to me it's sort of like being direct. It feels really important at this point, because I've kind of have mucked around in that stuff with you try things out and decide what works. But it is nice to be able to decide for yourself and upend, like, you know, it's not about should, it's kind of like, it feels pure, that's it purely because that's what makes you feel better, that's what keeps it simple, that's what keeps it, you know, moving, chugging along.
Right, yeah. And there's also something about intimacy there, because, you know, when you have intimacy issues, it's usually around not wishing to be known.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So what happens, almost the reverse, I guess, of this whole story, what happens when you let yourself be known all the time?
Right, exactly.
You know, that's true intimacy.
That's the
right?
intimacy hound way.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And it does make your life more challenging. You know, because I think we're not a society that is set up for truth. And yet we get so upset when we find out that something isn't true.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So there's something in there, I think, about how consumable this character was.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with JT, I think also at the moment of that fiction coming out, it was a sort of like, to me, people were consuming his victimhood too. And I think that's something, like, often that's very alluring to, I think it's that narrative of, like, I think the media wants you to portray yourself as a victim. It's a way to kind of make things, it's a kind of consumability. It's like, well, why do you get to take up space? I don't know, that's something, it's a kind of a part of the narrative and a part of the books, but also terrible things happen to people, and so that's real. That's the real part.
But that's the uncomfortable bit, right?
I think so.
Because, you know, this character was a kind of almost a sort of, you know, like too much to be true almost, you know, HIV positive, was a hustler, you know, abused as a kid, trailer trash, everything.
Right.
And then out of it, this idea that somebody could be this literary genius, this star, right?
And a narrative of redemption. You turned it around and you made a great book out of it, right? So, yeah. And I think I think that's is a role, like as artists and anyone who makes any kind of art, it is sort of our role to, it is the role of an artist to find the nuance and the complications of an experience or an idea, and that the role of propaganda is amply filled by other forms.
Political forms, absolutely. Right, because I guess, you know, we were talking a little bit about this kind of post-truth moment, right? Where things that are kind of too fantastical to be real are in fact the truth.
Right.
And then what is kind of fictional and made up almost pales kind of in comparison. I think you probably have quite a unique perspective on that.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, but yeah, I mean, I have a project about the baths. There's a Turkish baths, Russian and Turkish baths in New York. And I've been making, doing these performances in the baths, and then I made a short experimental film about it. But to me, what brought me into that was, it was sort of like, it was after the election, and I was going in there to find a way, it was a way to relax and be, just go inside. But it's a very social space. People go, and they've gone for years. And I was struck by all of the conversations that were happening there about politics. People were really getting into these fights about politics, and I think after our election in the US, there was this feeling of shock that, and also people, it's like, you want people to think like you, and you want to convince people of your opinion, and you want it, you can't believe that they don't, sort of. But I was struck by the way that people would negotiate and want to convince each other in 240 degrees heat. It was like, our brains are too hot, actually, too. And the thing we do have in common is our bodies in this heat. But I feel like, yeah, I don't know, about, it does feel sort of, it's a weird time where things feel very, you know, I'm struck by the relativism of this time, but also I feel like maybe I used to think that things were more mushy, like in the intro I say that, and I just, at this point, it's like there are facts and there is, it does feel like we're living in a fantasy world in the media, so.
Do you want to just outline the work a little bit more? Because it is actually like a super interesting video piece,
the video.
Right?
Yeah. So the Russian and Turkish baths in New York are, they are in the East Village, and they've been around since 1892. And they have two owners that got in a fight, and so they've split their business under one house, and they have different business practices. Every week they switch off, and so you take out all the signs, and one of them brings in his espresso machine, he keeps the heat hotter, and he does all cash, gray market negotiations. It's kind of like he'll cut you a deal depending on his mood. And his week particularly creates this very thriving social space. And it's unique to New York, and it's unique to the East Village. I mean, maybe like every city, New York is always changing and shifting, but the East Village it's been developed through, so this is an unusual space. You kind of can't believe that it exists now. And it's also very kind of funky, bare, dirty.
There's like tape on everything.
Tape.
It's like kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
Bit, you know. Like.
Yeah, and you look up and you're like, whoa, the pipe is wrapped in duct tape. And also you go in and you get burned and you think, that's not supposed to happen in a business in America. Why is, because we're so crazy too. So, but I think it's like people just love this space so much, or they need the heat and they need the temperature range. And they need the social space a lot as well. It's part of that. And it's not a kind of quiet bathhouse. It's very noisy. It's very social. And people have these amazing body practices in there that feel very performative and are for one another, but also are just what they do in there. And so I started this project in there around the turn of the 2016 election. I've been doing it for 3 years now, but first I would just do performances in the space, which was kind of, to me, the project is sort of about, what is an insider and what is an outsider, because there is this whole culture of regulars, and there, I guess, would be the insiders of the space. But that notion is always, it's always, like the lens is always expanding and contracting. We can feel so inside and then immediately so outside. So I would do these performances and invite people in to bathe and do these movement pieces that would kind of break open they'd be within the range of what you would do in the baths, but I would do air marshal signals or Meryl Streep postcards from the edge where you just fall. You go, I don't know, you fall. Or you try to flap your wings, maybe you can fly, but it would kind of be about, I guess, carving out the space of like what our social codes usually are.
Yeah. There's a wonderful bit in this video piece where you're, I guess, doing something with the newspaper, and it's this gigantic broadsheet, and then the guy walks past and he's kind of like, oh, that's new, that's different. I've seen people read before, but I don't know what's kind of going on here. And I thought that was so interesting, like, because you were doing this thing with this paper that was just so bizarre, like in this sweaty, hot, wet environment. And he was like, even the practice of reading, I think, seemed a bit bizarre. You know what I mean? So he was referring to this like bizarre thing, and then you were like pushing it further.
Right.
You know what I mean? I just thought that was like very, very interesting.
Anxiety of current events.
Anxiety, yeah. What is the news anyway?
Yeah.
You know, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, maybe it is connected to this work too, probably. Like they're traveling along the same track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's also a kind of idea about acceptance.
Yes.
As well.
Right.
Like initially, we were talking last night at dinner, and we were, I know, right, I don't want to fuck up the mic, but we were saying like, I said like when I first, started thinking about this, you know, my prejudice, I guess, or my like perception was that I was going to be meeting this person that I'd heard so much about, and JT, yeah, this character, and then I started to really rethink that term hoax, you know what I mean? Because I was like, I don't know if that's entirely sensitive or accurate, and then there's something about the work that you're doing now which just seems so much about pushing and performance, but also community and acceptance.
Right.
Is that an accurate way?
Yeah, that feels accurate. Yeah, yes.